The Joe Rogan Experience.
I would also remind everybody of this with respect to the drug price discussion. That bill, that H.R. 3 bill, it won't become law because the Senate won't take it up and the president won't sign it. But if it did, it wouldn't hurt big pharma. I think Democrats would like to believe that it would hurt big pharmaceutical companies. It wouldn't. It would put all of the smaller startup biotech companies totally out of business because they're the ones who actually, they start that innovation. Just like happens in Silicon Valley, these startups start it and then they get bought out by the bigger companies. That's sort of how the system works, and it's a very dynamic system. It's why we are by far the number one innovator in the world. No other country innovates like we do. They don't do the research like we do. If we implemented the price controls that are inherent in Medicare for All or H.R. 3, there wouldn't be anybody else in the world doing what we do. I can relate that back to the coronavirus discussion too, because there's a big discussion about, should we have Medicare for all? Doesn't coronavirus prove that everybody should have free healthcare? And again, what I have to remind everybody is that if we had Medicare for all, what we're basically talking about are price controls, because Medicare already pays below average payment for anything, for whatever service, for whatever doctor visit. It's about 60-70% on the dollar.
Can I stop you right there? Medicare is available for who right now? What is the
seniors? Medicare is a senior program.
Right. So what age is it? Does it kick in? Is it 65?
I believe so. I don't want to confuse it with Social Security.
So the idea is that for older folks, we should give them health care and make sure that their basic needs are covered in terms of sickness, illness, injury, and such. Yeah. I mean, the entire, we could argue that we could even debate the merits of Medicare on its face. But Medicare for all would be available for everybody. Now, if Medicare for all was available for everybody, what you're saying is it would essentially you would fix prices on everything in terms of medical treatments, and that would be a problem because of what? Well, so once you fix prices, well, imagine this. Imagine if the government said that your podcast could only take $100 per ad, and that was just the price fix from now on, what incentive would you have to really expand your audience? What incentive would you have to keep going or expand the business? You wouldn't be able to. It's similar under any industry. Once you fix that price, you're going to reduce the supply that goes into it. Can I stop you on that analogy? Yeah. Here's the problem with that. The difference is if there would have to be a reason why they would say that I could only get $100 per ad. The reason why you would say that things shouldn't cost too much for someone who's injured or sick is because we want to take care of each other as a community. And the idea is that healthcare should be something. Look, we provide so many services to people that we are united, right? We're the United States of America. We're supposed to be a gigantic community. And one of the great things that we could do for each other is to make sure that if someone's sick or injured and something's wrong, that we can take care of that. We would like everybody to do their share, and we would like everybody to chip in so that this is possible. But there's a big difference between that and fixing the price on an ad. Well, no, but not economically. There's no difference. Morally, there is, and I agree with you. Morally, we have the same goal of getting everybody adequate care. Right, but from an economic standpoint. But from an economic standpoint, my point still stands, and you can apply that to any industry. I see what you're saying, but I think we're looking at medical care as a basic human right instead of just an economic issue. The reason I don't describe it as it's not, and you're right, it is both a moral and an economic issue. But for my argument that you will reduce supply, that is fundamentally true. It is fundamentally true. We see it in other countries. It's why, as we compare ourselves to other countries right now, all these places with socialized medicine, it's important to look at some stats. And actually, I have them here. I could take the time to pick them up, but I'll give you the bottom line up front. We have overwhelmingly per capita more ICU beds in this country than any other Western country. Overwhelmingly per capita, we have more ventilators than any of these other people. We're all freaking out right now because we're worried about our ventilators and our ICU beds. On a per capita basis, our system has way, way more than the UK, than Italy, than Spain, than Germany, all of them. Like orders of magnitude more.
Okay, so also we're the ones who innovate. I mean, the vast majority of research and development, new drugs that come out, that comes from this country. So these are facts that we can't escape. If we do price controls, and Medicare for All is fundamentally a system of price controls. If we do that, economically speaking, we absolutely will reduce supply. Now, I understand the moral argument you're making, which is we still want to help people. Yes, we should. We should be looking for the ways to do that. But I want to be able to do that in a way that doesn't undercut the foundations of the good parts of our healthcare system, which is quality and innovation. If we undercut those things, and we're the last country doing this, we're the last country in the world truly doing innovation, the world is left out to dry.
Can I pause you there? What you're saying makes a lot of sense. Is there a way to do both? Is there a way to provide healthcare to everyone, but also encourage this innovation, encourage profit, so you encourage these companies to do all these great things that you're describing and maintain this incredibly high level of healthcare that we have right now?
That's certainly the goal, right? And that should be the goal. And this is why I think there's got to be room for compromise on the healthcare debate, because you can't compromise with the other party if the goals aren't the same. Like I've come to believe that our goals on immigration are actually not the same. Okay, so it's hard to compromise. On healthcare, they should be the same. Like, because we want everybody to have access to quality healthcare. Now, they have a very different way of getting to that point. We have probably a much more complicated. We recognize how difficult it is to get to that point while also ensuring that we maintain quality and innovation. And so what I'm working on personally is the primary care side of things. Okay, so primary care doctor that's your first point of contact in healthcare. And the system that I think works best for that is direct primary care. So direct primary care basically means that you, Joe, you're a doctor. You can handle about 250, 300 patients at a time. They all pay you a subscription fee of about $75 a month, and they have full access to you. So it's like less than a cell phone bill. This already exists. This model is prevalent. It's growing. I would like to see it grow much faster. Okay, how do you do that? Well, we can't subsidize lower income people in order to do that. Now, how we do that is very complicated. That's what I'm working out within our complicated system. But that's an idea to make that free market model actually take off so that people who don't need help with their healthcare costs, like you and me, we can still afford that just like we afford any other monthly cost. And you have access to preventive medicine. You have access to telemedicine. You actually have a doctor-patient relationship. That makes it a lot easier to start solving the rest of the problem, making our insurance market more competitive, putting more choice in it, directly subsidizing those who need it, but in a way that looks a lot more like Medicare Advantage. So Medicare Advantage is a part of Medicare that basically forces competition and choice between insurance companies. It came out to be a lot cheaper than we originally thought it would in the early 2000s when this thing was created. This was a Republican plan because there's certain foundations that I think we have to adhere to anytime we want to problem solve. Choice and competition are among them. You can't escape those things. And I think when we talk about Medicare for All, it tries to move past these essential foundations, whether of a free society that we have to adhere to, and because the other thing I push back on a little bit is the healthcare is a right statement. And I push back against that because when you're calling something a right, what you're effectively saying is that somebody else has a obligation to serve you. And it's hard to call something a right when that right requires the service of somebody else.
But don't we already do that? Don't we already do that with the firemen? Don't we do that with the police department? Don't we do that with public schools?
Not exactly. No, I mean we have public services that I would distinguish those public services from something like a direct point of care, and I would distinguish them to an enormous extent. Like, and here's why: you can add a few 100,000 more people to the nation's population, and it doesn't change the mission of the military, right? Like it doesn't take anything away from them. But because of this sort of non-rival, this is like an economics term, but this sort of non-rival attribute of these things, it is different, right? Because there's only a select number of doctors. And we've already said that once you put price controls in, there's going to be less doctors because doctors will be paid less. They'll get burned out more. Then hospitals will be able to, I actually never finished that point. The reason price controls reduce supply, and the reason we see supply reductions in other countries is because, well, hospitals don't get the same amount of money. They're not going to invest in that extra ICU bed. They're not going to buy those extra ventilators. They're not going to hire those other doctors. A doctor doesn't want to be a doctor because they don't make the amount of money that they thought they would make. They're doing extra work because there's more people who now have access to them, but there's less of them. So wait lines are huge, and they're seeing multiple more patients a day. Doctor burnout increases quite a bit. That's the quick answer as to why that happens. But does that kind of answer your question? This is getting really deep on this.
Yeah, the human right issue. We kind of moved around with that. The idea that it's different than the fire department or the police department, or
well, it's not a right either. Actually, the fire department's not necessarily a right as we would.
But it's a public service that's provided to everyone.
Yeah, it is. But understand. So let's call it a public service then, and let's call healthcare a public service as well, if we were to do Medicare for all.
But wouldn't the result be the same if it's provided for everyone?
Not from a practical standpoint, just because it's much easier. Again, you could add 100,000 people more to your city, and the fire department would have marginally more work to do, compared to like a doctor, for instance. Does that make sense? Like, it doesn't. I think if we're trying to compare them in that sense, that non-rival attribute matters quite a bit, if I'm describing that correctly.
So what you're saying is because competition is necessary with medical innovation, and also like doctors profit off of being exceptional. So they have incentive to be exceptional.
No. What I'm saying is if you have 10 doctors that are serving a community, every time that doctor is serving somebody, it means somebody else can't see them.
Well, isn't that just a signal that we need more doctors and more hospitals?
It is.
They're understaffed?
Yeah. It would be, yes. But I'm saying that's how it's different from a fire department, which is sort of lying in wait for a fire to occur.
Well, if there was more fires.
Yeah, but it's just unlikely most of the time. I'm trying to distinguish why those aren't very comparable things. Like why one is more of a public service that we see to work while the other wouldn't necessarily be. And you kind of just said it yourself. It would be a signal for there to be more doctors, which is why the free market price points are so important, because the only way to signal that is to actually that demand raises prices. When the government tries to do that, now there's this theory as a socialist that they would say the government can just figure that out. I would say that they've tried that in the past. It never works. It never ever works. The government can't possibly be so omniscient as to know every single price signal and anticipate every single piece of demand and production that is therefore required. And so, it's not just healthcare that this is a problem. It's every aspect of society.
So if I can go back to what you were saying earlier, so what you're essentially saying about socialism, that socialism looks at this problem and says, hey, let's make the government take care of everything. Let's take money from the wealthy people and pour it into the government, and that the government will then have resources to take care of these issues. And you're just looking at the first step of the problem. You're not looking at the secondary or tertiary instances or things that are going to go sideways once you do implement that first step. Is that what you're saying?
It's 100% what I'm saying. I would add socialism leaves out some very important things, like human nature, for instance, and this notion that we need incentives. Socialism doesn't believe in incentives. Doesn't believe that we need incentive to do things. There's this utopian belief amongst the hardcore socialists that humans will act in this kind of philanthropic manner, no matter what. Like, we're going to do the most amount of work, even if that reward is overwhelmingly taken away from us and redistributed. But of course, that's not how it would actually function in reality.
Yeah, I agree.
You would start to, it just wouldn't, right? And so now maybe for a few altruistic people would be the ones, doing all the work while everybody else is like pretending to work, which was what happened in the Soviet Union. You pretend to pay us, we'll pretend to work, right? Like that was the saying from the Soviet Union. I think we intuitively understand that, and when that happens, and again, the same thing with Medicare for all. If you have price controls, your incentives change, And if we're not really serious about understanding that aspect of these policies, then we're not thinking through them correctly. And I understand a lot of Democrats would say, well, it's Medicare for all, it's not socialism. And I'm like, yeah, but it has very socialistic tendencies, and it has these qualities that I've described of not taking into account the second, third order effects, of removing human incentive, of forcing somebody's services, and because you're calling it a right, which means that you now have a right to somebody else's services. Like these are things that have been proven not to work, and I think we have to understand that as we try to move towards the mutual goal of getting everybody access to healthcare.
Well, it doesn't work with everything, yeah. But it doesn't that work with the fire department? Isn't the fire department in a lot of ways a socialist institution?
No. Again, I still say it is not, because it is not under any obligation to serve everybody that demands its service. Right? It's there for a specific emergency service as a public good.
But it's there for fire. If there's a fire, they come in and help you. There's not a financial incentive for them to do so.
Right, but I mean, but on a practical level, though, imagine the scaling that has to occur if you're doing that with medical care, and I think that's the difference, both from an economic point and a practical standpoint.
Right, so, but we're talking about you're talking about socialism overall, not just just involving medicine. You're talking about socialism in general, and I'm saying, isn't the fire department an example of socialism that works?
Well, it's definitely not an example of socialism. I think it's an example of a public good, the way the military is an example of a public good, the way the highways are examples of public goods, the way parks are examples of public goods. Right, but they're
funded by the people. It's funded by people overall, and it doesn't cost people money to use them, and the people have these as a basic part of our society and our civilization.
No, I understand that, and I have no problem with that. I just would not call them socialists.
Well, what would you call the fire department? How does it get funded?
It's a public good.
How does it get funded?
It's a public good. It's funded by the public,
right?
And it's not relying on it's not relying on the tenets of socialism to function. And so now we're kind of having a discussion of definitions, and this is an important discussion to have, because oftentimes even Democrats aren't really talking about socialism.
Well, even Bernie Sanders doesn't call it socialism. He's talking about democratic socialism, and he makes some very clear distinctions between the two of them, which I think you could apply to things like the fire department or the police department.
Yeah, there's a lot in that. So I think Bernie, yes, he does say democratic socialism. I think he does mean something much closer to socialism, and that's just me gleaning from his policies, because he does talk about putting government control on corporate boards. Elizabeth Warren talked about the same thing. So now we really are talking about nationalizing things. When you're talking about mass price controls across all industries and wage controls, you really are talking about more of an actual socialism. Again, going back to whether a fire department or a park or a public highway or the military is a socialist institution, again, I would really push back against that. That is a public good. We've never, in our culture, in our economics, we've never defined these things as socialist institutions. Now, socialist institution effectively means you're seizing the means of production, and you're forcing everybody into a centralized planning state. You're telling people what they will earn and what you will pay them, how much they can sell. You start to take more control over the economy. A lot of the policies set out by Bernie Sanders are movements in that direction. The fire department is really not. That is a public service. It has a defined budget. It has a defined role. It doesn't meet any of those other attributes or elements that I describe when I describe what a socialist is. And so this gets into another question, like maybe Bernie just means the Nordic countries, right? And I remember the foreign minister from Denmark came to Harvard. I think he gave a speech. This was a few years ago. And he said, stop calling us socialists. We're not socialists. We're probably, and I would agree with him. All these Nordic countries have, frankly, more of a free market than we do in many ways. When we look at their regulatory standards, they're quite liberal. When we look at their corporate tax rate, it's very low. They don't have a minimum wage. in many cases. And so, you know, they're not socialist countries. What they do have is a very generous welfare state. And that's different than, and even that is different than socialism. It's a giant welfare state. Now, I'm still against that in many ways. I think there's consequences to that giant welfare state that they now have to suffer with as a result. And if you've noticed too, that they actually used to be very socialist countries, but their economies crashed as a result. And over time, they became much more free market. We see the same thing out of Israel. We see the same thing out of India. It used to be much more deeply socialist countries. A lot of them have just maintained their big welfare states, which they are having trouble paying for, just like we're having trouble paying for our big welfare state, which is mostly based in Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare.
When you say public good, right, this is what you feel that the fire department is. It's a public good, right? Do you think that it's possible to implement something like that in regards to medical care?
Yeah. I mean, so this is a discussion. If we get our definition straight, and we're just saying, okay, we just want another public good, and it's medical care. So it's a more accurate way of describing it.
I think people don't care what it's called, right? We just want health care.
Well, right. But then we get back to the discussion we had before. Okay, what if we did that? Well, there's a cost to it, and it's a hell of a lot more than the fire department and police department. The cost by most estimates is in the mid $30-something trillion.
Per year?
That's a cost on for over 10 years. Okay. So about $3.5 trillion per year. So that's basically doubling our budget just every year. That's in addition to what we already spend. Okay, so that's additional federal spending. Some people try to massage those numbers and say, oh, but that's actually cheaper than what we have now if you add it all together. That is false. That is completely false. I have a whole podcast where I actually interviewed the guy who made that study, the economist who did that study. And that's not a controversial study. Everybody basically agrees. Elizabeth Warren's plan was $50-something trillion. That's adding what we already spend to the new spending that would have to occur. So what does that mean in practice? It means doubling or tripling your taxes, unless we try to deficit spend it, which I think would be crazy. So it means doubling or tripling your taxes. And then the question is, okay, fine. Well, I do want to double or triple my taxes. I mean, some people will say that. I don't actually believe them. I bet once they got their taxes, they would totally change their mind. But let's say they're totally into it. Okay, let's say they actually want to do that. Then you have the second and third order consequences, which is, okay, what are you getting for this? What is this new utopia that we really live in where healthcare is free? And then I go back to, okay, in order to meet that price point of the $3.5 trillion a year, that's by the way, assuming that we continue using Medicare prices, which is what all the plans do assume, by the way. So if we're doing that, we're drastically cutting prices that we pay doctors and hospitals. If we do that, we drastically cut our supply of doctors and hospitals, and we cut off and choke off the innovative capacity that we do have. So we're losing those quality points. Again, so how do you get people care? Well, the main problem we have with healthcare in this country is that it costs too much. That's fundamentally the problem. It is too costly. And so from the Republican side, what we'd rather do is actually target the source of the problem, make it easier to get insurance. Because right now, I mean, it's for so many Americans, that insurance is just too expensive. If you have it through your employer, it's usually pretty good. People are pretty happy with that. But for the most part, it's too expensive, which is why I go back to my direct primary care idea, because once you solve the primary care issue, you make solving insurance much easier. Then you can still protect people with pre-existing conditions. We like things like either high risk pools at the state level or reinsurance programs. You can make this. You can continue to make improvements to the system that make it affordable for people and give people access that they need, while also competitive edge.
Sorry, broke up there for a second. This whole connection of doing things remotely sucks. Can you say that last statement again? Just the last few words that you said?
Well,
you were talking about insurance. Here's my question about the whole thing. Like, insurance still has to pay for it then. You're still paying, someone's still paying for all this health care. If the insurance companies aren't making any profit because they're paying for all the health care, then what happens then? Do we fund the insurance companies? I mean, how does all this stuff get evened out?
Are you referring to cases where, the cost of somebody's care is so astronomically expensive that even the insurance company can't afford it?
Well, look, here's the problem, right? People can't afford health care, so we get them insurance. Insurance takes care of health care. How do the insurance companies make any money then?
Well, I mean, they make a profit just like anybody else, but they're also what we've found is, especially with our experiments with Medicare Advantage, is when you pit insurance companies against each other in a free market, they lower costs. They are a natural. There's different elements of the healthcare system. On one side is driving up costs, because a doctor wants to keep doing more tests or whatever it is, or a patient wants to do more things. The insurance company's job is to say, hold on a second. Why are you doing this? What is the reason for this? What's the outcome that we expect from this? So that naturally drives, that's a natural, bulwark against higher costs. The government would, in a Medicare for All scheme, the government would simply replace that insurance company. We should be very careful when assuming that the government will somehow be better at that than insurance companies. I'm not saying insurance companies are great at all. Everybody doesn't seem to like them. But I also don't want the government doing it. I don't want to be in a case like in Great Britain where the government will say, you know what, your granddad's not on the ventilator anymore. We're done with that. Or your baby can't get that care. I mean, we've all seen these stories, and we don't have that issue in America.
But can I pause you? Don't we have a problem with insurance companies not want to pay for certain things?
They might, but the care still happens. The hospital has to eat that care a lot, and there's different funding mechanisms that reimburse them. We have I'm not defending our healthcare system. I want to be clear about that. It's definitely not perfect. It's a huge patchwork, but no, that's not the way it happens over there. Because over there, like in Great Britain, if you actually nationalize the healthcare system the way they do, when they say you're not going to be on the ventilator anymore, there's no choice. Like that is the decision, and that's what they have to deal with. And so it is different.
But don't they have some private health care over there as well?
I think they might have elements of it. Same with Canada, but not for basic care. Like, so for other kinds of health care that aren't necessarily, like elective stuff,
orthopedic surgeries.
And I'd have to really get some details for you on what each country does, but it's limited. They limit what they can actually do.